Hi, I'm Greg Corombos. My guest at this time is Christopher C. Horner. He was a member of the Trump Transition Landing Team at the Environmental Protection Agency in 2016-2017. He is also an attorney and board member at Government Accountability and Oversight, and you can find them online at govoversight.org. We've asked him to join us today to discuss scientific modeling. We see it a lot with coronavirus projections for infections and deaths, but they're also relied upon for other areas of study, including climate science. And that's where we will be focused for the next several minutes. And Chris, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, Greg.
Well, one of the things we've heard from Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx and others as this has unfolded over the past several weeks is that models are only as good as the data being fed into it. So when it comes to climate models, what's being fed into them?
Let me qualify that a little more. Models are only as good as the model itself, too. Remember, we've got two components where you can dictate the outcome, whether intentionally or not. That is, the model is your calculation. And your assumptions are, if you want, for example, climate, to answer your question, if you want carbon dioxide to be a control knob, then you build that into your model. That's an assumption. And you also can have other assumptions about the impact of clouds as you believe it to be, or sun, which even the UN says, well, we don't quite know the sun's impact on climate. So maybe come back to me when you do. That seems like a rather big one. So it's the design of the model, and it's the assumptions in what you put in, the inputs. And so the takeaway is when you decide that man is going to drive climate, don't be surprised when the models say he does. This current situation should be a very humbling one. It's good that Dr. Fauci is saying this. We need to make it a teachable moment. We need to accept that, because we see that the parallel is we're making these gravely consequential, highly damaging for social and economic reasons, governmental policy decisions based on computer model projections. And then we see, in this case, after just a few weeks, that the more data you put into the model, the worse its projections are compared to reality when you look out the window. And we have a benefit in climate. We've seen decades now, actually, of proof that they're wrong. Not just that they may not be right. We've got proof that they're wrong because we did give ourselves time to look out the window. So I did see a great quote by the Wall Street Journal's James Freeman, who says it would be helpful to flatten the curve of belief in popular virus predictions. I would extend that. We need to flatten the curve in this idea that climate model projections are anything other than a projection. One more quote. There's a Stanford professor who was interviewed over the weekend in the Journal, and he said he's focused on models and why they're wrong his whole career. And he says they can give you a very first kind of mathematical justification to a gut feeling. Is it generally going this way, looking for a trend or a reaction? But beyond that, depending upon them for evidence, he says, is a very bad recipe. We've seen it here, and I assure you, we see it in the climate realm, where you're talking about this kind of economic harm, not just forever, but this kind of annual compounding, this kind of reduction year over year, not just year after year, but a reduction like this harm made this much worse next year, made that much worse the year after, and so on in perpetuity. It's time to recognize model limitations.
And we'll get into that more in just a moment. But one of the things we've also seen, again, jumping off of the coronavirus models here, is that infection and death projections change drastically, even with some of the same assumptions here. Initially, if there weren't going to be major mitigation efforts, I think it was like 1.7 million were expected to die. Then they said, well, even if we do all the mitigation at this point, it's going to be between 100,000 and 240,000. And now they've moved that estimation for deaths down to about 60,000. At this point, it looks like they'll probably be a little bit north of that at least. But when that much changes in such a short period of time, how then do you begin to process models looking at decades or centuries from now?
Right. That was an excellent experience in that we saw people trying to be very clever in saying, well, I didn't know you would behave this well. And so that's why you see the body count being so much lower than I projected. And then you look and you see that they actually did assume great attention to social distancing and other mitigation. Okay, that was a big red flag. If it bleeds, it leads, and there's a great incentive for the lurid scenario, and there appears to be no price to be paid for being constantly wrong if you're constantly wrong on erring on the side of these lurid scenarios. And politicians have the same, obviously, incentive. They don't want to be accused of having been insufficiently attentive to a risk. And therefore, they adopt this dangerous idea that we call the precautionary principle. Well, just in case, I can't guarantee no one will ever be hurt if they ride this newfangled invention called a bicycle. Therefore, we won't permit it. We wouldn't have air travel and so on. With climate, it's much, much worse. So the modelers, let's say some of the more honest ones did say, well, this doesn't assume social distancing, and this does. And so the behavior changed our projections. This is something that you and I have discussed over the years, and it's what a great moment to remind ourselves. The climate models do not project that even if we do this to ourselves, whatever all these agreements are demanding, that it would have any impact on the climate. In other words, as I've pointed out over and over, it's about something, but it's not about the climate. It seems to be, if you look at the glee emanating from the deep green environmentalists, it seemed to be about imposing this privation, and it's largely about population. As you know, there are too many other people on the planet in their eyes. The models, the Paris Treaty, cap and trade, cap and tax, the Kyoto Treaty, none of that, what do they call carbon taxes? None of that actually is projected to impact the climate. So while the COVID virus modelers, some of them would say, well, this involves, so if you do social distance, and then this will be the outcome in our model if you don't. The climate models actually project the same outcome, even if we do ratify the Paris Treaty and perfectly implement it and so on. That's a key distinction. The COVID virus and these mitigation efforts, social distancing, are clearly about mitigating the COVID virus. But the climate demands wouldn't actually impact the climate. They would, as we see, leave us much poorer to deal with all the threats we always have to deal with, among them being an often severe, always unpredictable climate.
Follow up on that if you can, Chris, because we've seen from AOC, for example, when the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, when the oil prices tanked a couple of weeks back, and she was saying, well, now is the perfect time for the Green New Deal. And with so much of the economy on hold, you're starting to see some scientific reports saying, oh, look, the pollution is going down now because of the traffic. The canal water in Venice is clearer now. And their answer is, see, this can be done. And the more conservative response is, well, yeah, you've got to destroy the economy to see any of this progress, if you want to call it progress. So what are we learning about this debate in an economic shutdown that's not really related to climate change?
So we are seeing an awful lot of people saying, well, I want visibility in the waters in Venice and so on. Great. Impose some regulations that will address the transparency of the waters in Venice. Don't shut down the global economy. You can restrict travel in Venice. But what we see is there are a lot of people saying, see, I told you you could do this. And none of them, by the way, are suffering under this. You don't see CNN reporters being laid off for the most part. They're saying, boy, look, this shows we can do this. No member of Congress is being laid off, though I suggest that should be in the cards. Anybody who's promoting this saying, see, I told you you could do this. Their life hasn't been changed very much, except maybe they wear a mask when they vote. They're causing terrible suffering, and something, by the way, we've mentioned for years, all sorts of abuse, substance, spousal, domestic, you name it, child. It all goes up in times like this. Regulation that slows economic activity, or let's say a regulatory agenda, is going to lead to human health impacts, human health and welfare, including many of the negatives we're seeing from the current economic collapse. It's a scripted collapse in their book. So you're talking about people who aren't experiencing any misery right now, but only inconvenience, saying, see, I told you you could do this. Very tone deaf to the true suffering. Have you seen, I know you have, you've seen the coverage of food banks. I and my kids have worked at our food closet. We see the demand going up. We see we're preparing more boxes every week. We see that this is not even doing the job, and yet it's at a record high. These are the results of these policies in the name of climate. Remember, a COVID mitigation policy does mitigate COVID. Climate policies are not even projected to impact the climate. It's always a good first step. It's funny, we've had decades of good first steps, and I still hear people like AOC on the floor saying, you have a do nothing. What if we continue to do nothing? Well, which time are you telling the truth? Have we had decades of, quote, good first steps, which itself is inherently not very honest? Or are we doing nothing? They're talking about drastically harming millions of people in the name of climate. They don't advertise what nobody disputes. It won't have any impact on climate. We've got a very good, unfortunate dry run scenario. Do you really want this? As they click their heels about that, they can see the water, they can see the bottom of the canals in Venice. At what price? Again, if you're worried about the canal water in Venice, address the canal water in Venice. But don't shut down the global economy in the name of climate change when, let's face it, nobody denies these policies wouldn't impact climate. They actually admit it in their computer models.
Well, Chris, that has certainly been borne out in a number of these climate efforts. I believe in particular the Paris climate effort, which not only would require the U.S. to make drastic economic changes, but the entire world. I believe they said they hoped there would be a tiny fraction of a degree change by 2050, but nothing that they could actually promise. Let me conclude our conversation pretty close to where we started, Chris. If I heard you correctly, I think you said it's much more profitable to study the climate based on what has already happened than try to predict what's going to happen. But if we're going to do any sort of modeling on this, what's the best way to avoid flawed models and flawed inputs? How should they be set up?
Well, for example, there's most of the media coverage you see on climate is based on what's called an RCP 8.5, which is the least likely, most lurid scenario, which has now been abandoned. It was always the outlier, least likely, but it's now been abandoned. But it's the basis for all of this hair on fire, we must act now. Well, the first thing you do is say, okay, well, why was it abandoned? Well, it assumes, for example, massive increase in coal consumption while coal companies are, as you know, being shrunk regularly. Consumption is falling through the floor. The rest of the world is saying they're going to increase theirs. The rich world has said, that's too scary for us. We need things that only work some of the time for much more money, like wind and solar. Their assumptions have been abandoned, and yet these models still play a role in policymakers' lives. They're still being disseminated on federal government websites. Their assumptions are cartoonish by this point. So you should start with, let's clean house. And ultimately, and this is what the president was trying to do when he floated the idea of a red team review of climate science, is these are all computer model projections. And we now have a nice teachable lesson in computer model projections and their reliability. Why don't we take a look at these projections, the calculations, the model, and the assumptions? The assumptions we know are wrong. The outputs we know are wrong. Maybe the models are wrong. Now's the time. As we keep hearing anything President Trump wants to do, well, I can't think of a worse time to do that. And anything that AOC et al. Want to do, well, this is exactly the time. Well, I can't think of a better time to say, you know what? We've put an awful lot of stock in these very expensive PlayStations that the taxpayer's been underwriting for years. And there seems to be a bit of a Willie Sutton attitude. Why do you rob banks, Willie? Well, why do you model warming? Lurid, catastrophic warming, Willie. It's definitely where the money is. If not now, when are you going to say, let's take a broad inventory of what sort of impact computer model projections have on governmental policy? Because, by the way, it goes well beyond climate. And let's start with what appear to be the worst actors. Who's been most wrong for the most long? And I think climate stands out in this class.
Chris, as you said, a lot to learn from this, and we'll see if the lessons actually are learned. Thanks very much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Greg.
Christopher C. Horner was a member of the Trump Transition Landing Team at the Environmental Protection Agency in 2016-2017. He's now an attorney and board member at Government Accountability and Oversight. You can find them at govoversight.org, and you can also find their publication, Climate Litigation Watch, at climatelitigationwatch.org. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.